What if Europe's greatest threat is not a sudden explosion, but a slow, silent implosion, advancing inch by inch while leaders look away? Picture a crisis so enormous, so deeply woven into the system, that it creeps forward unnoticed beneath the surface of official optimism and polished speeches, until one day the ground drops out from under an entire continent. This is not a far-off risk. It is the peril taking shape right now, hidden behind comforting words like unity and shared values issued from the grand podiums of Brussels. Let us be clear. Every time officials extol the virtues of European democracy or partnership, they are often shielding us from what is quietly crumbling underneath. The reassuring language, the endless repetition of old slogans, these are not solutions. They are rituals of denial, as if speaking the words can hold back a rising tide. Meanwhile, the foundations, the legal, social, and strategic bedrock that has kept Europe secure since the end of World War II, are showing cracks that few dare to acknowledge. Consider how, in the twilight years of the Roman Empire, senators continued to praise the glory of Rome even as the barbarians laid siege to the gates. Or how, on the eve of the First World War, European monarchs toasted peace, blind to the alliances and hostilities spiraling out of control. History is thick with examples of leaders clinging to optimistic narratives right up to the moment the world changes forever. Europe risks repeating these mistakes now. Then, Viktor Orban shattered the silence. The Hungarian Prime Minister did not merely hint or speculate. He broke a taboo by naming what others would not: secret plans to carve up Ukraine. For months, Europe's ruling class refused to admit this was even a possibility. Now, thanks to Orban's bluntness, the unthinkable is being discussed in daylight. Orban has said aloud what was once unspeakable. Not only might Russia win, but maps are already being drawn, lines debated, and zones of control imagined. What was once a nightmare scenario is being prepared for behind closed doors, as if it is becoming normal policy. Imagine diplomats in quiet rooms, rulers with rulers and maps, quietly sketching out a future that was once dismissed as Kremlin propaganda. The danger here is not limited to Kiev or Moscow. Every European who believes in democracy, stability, and the rule of law has reason to worry. If we continue to ignore the signals, we risk waking up to a continent where the rules have changed overnight, and nobody saw it coming. This is how history's great reversals occur, quietly, then all at once. Taboos are being shattered, and what was once impossible is now treated as likely. The debate has moved. The unthinkable is now being normalized in public. In the 1930s, the gradual acceptance of the Munich Agreement, chopping up Czechoslovakia in the name of peace, was similarly justified as realism. The lessons were bitter. But looking away does not slow the storm. If denial persists, the very bedrock of European security and democracy could be swept away. And by the time the alarm is finally sounded, it may be too late to save what matters most. So how did Europe's leaders let it come to this? To understand, we need to examine the widening chasm between public narratives and the harsh realities playing out across the continent. When leaders stop whispering and begin redrawing borders in daylight, the world should pay attention. For Europe, this moment has arrived. The masks are off, and the fate of Ukraine, and perhaps the continent itself, is being negotiated with chilling transparency. Hungary's Viktor Orban has crossed a line few dared to approach. He has publicly mapped out a future for Ukraine that is not unified, but carved into 3 zones: Russian-held territories, demilitarized buffers, and what remains of sovereign Ukraine. These are not idle suggestions, but detailed blueprints, with boundaries defined not by consensus, but by force and calculation. Orban envisions a partitioned Ukraine, with Russian control measured in regions and kilometers, not just in headlines or press releases. This is not without precedent. Consider the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, when Britain and France quietly plotted to carve up the Ottoman Empire, redrawing borders with little regard for the people who lived there. The echoes are unmistakable. Powerful outsiders dividing territories to suit their interests, with the fate of millions decided behind closed doors. This has shifted the debate in Europe's capitals. The question is no longer whether Russia will seize territory, but how much it will keep. Some policymakers discuss 2 regions, others 4, and a few whisper about as many as 6. It is a cold calculus. Negotiation is now about the size of Russia's gains and how wide the buffer zones must be to appease military planners. In Kyiv, leaders still speak of resilience and ultimate victory. But the reality is harsher. The front lines have stalled, lost ground remains unrecovered, and Western support is fading, delayed, diminished, and increasingly uncertain. Just as the Allies in the late 1930s hesitated to fully back Poland after Hitler's invasion, today's Western hesitation is sending signals to both friends and foes. Official optimism is colliding with battlefield losses and a slow, dangerous erosion of political will from Europe and America alike. Each delay in promised aid, each debate about the cost of support, chips away at the sense of solidarity that once seemed unbreakable. This is not just a policy problem, it is a crisis of belief. Into this tension, Orban has hurled a diplomatic grenade. He insists that peace talks must happen not in Washington, but in Moscow. According to Orban, the real decisions are made in the Kremlin, while American involvement is becoming little more than theater. He urges European leaders to face this reality, to travel to Moscow and secure a deal while there is still leverage to be had. The proposed compromise is as blunt as it is brutal. Ukraine would be forced to abandon its ambitions of joining the European Union and NATO in exchange for a fragile, perhaps temporary peace. Orban's vision is not of heroism or democratic triumph, but of an uneasy pause, a divided nation, a new status quo, and Russia's gains locked in for a generation or more. This echoes the fate of divided Germany after World War II, a nation forced into stasis, its people caught between rival blocs. This open talk of partition and backroom deals is more than shocking. It is a warning flare. If Europe fails to recognize what is happening, Ukraine could be irreversibly split, and the consequences will not stop at its borders. European credibility, security guarantees, and strategic influence are all at risk. The continent itself could be left fractured and dangerously exposed, with its values and future stability hanging in the balance. Imagine, for example, the chilling effect such a deal would have on other nations in Russia's shadow: Moldova, Georgia, the Baltic states. A precedent of division invites more aggression, not less. If one country can be carved up, why not another next year or in 5 years? The logic of appeasement rarely ends where it begins. But this new clarity is not being met with action. Instead, a widening gap opens between official narratives and the shifting realities that threaten to upend Europe's future. What happens when a rising superpower decides it will no longer play by Washington's rules? That question is no longer theoretical. India has made it clear. It will not be strong-armed by the United States or its traditional Western partners. When Washington tried to punish India for buying Russian oil, it rolled out heavy tariffs and threatened sanctions. But instead of backing down, New Delhi charted its own course, a move that is now shaking the foundations of global power. This echoes the non-aligned movement of the Cold War, when countries like India, Egypt, and Yugoslavia refused to pick sides, instead forging their own paths and building new alliances. India tightened its partnership with Russia and began deepening its ties with China. Trade routes shifted. Indian exports, once heavily dependent on American buyers, started flowing toward Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. The old patterns of American dominance are dissolving, replaced by new alliances that do not rely on Washington's approval, or even its participation. As Indian exports to the United States plunged, Washington's leverage vanished almost overnight. New Delhi did not just survive the pressure, it adapted. For every dollar lost in American trade, India quickly found new markets eager to do business, sometimes on better terms. This resilience caught many in the West off guard. Consider how, during the OPEC oil embargo of the 1970s, Western nations were forced to adapt rapidly to a world where old certainties no longer held. The United States tried to build a united European front against India. Instead, the move exposed the growing cracks in Western unity. European leaders, already overwhelmed by their own crises, balked at the prospect of alienating India, a nation essential to global supply chains and future growth. In Germany, for example, industrial leaders warned that isolating India would threaten entire sectors, from pharmaceuticals to information technology. What stands out is India's approach. Rather than escalate, New Delhi responded with remarkable restraint, emphasizing maturity and strategic autonomy. Indian officials calmly asserted their right to make independent policy, refusing to accept double standards or lectures from abroad. The consequences for the West are profound. Losing India as a partner means surrendering influence over the heart of the world's economic and political future. This is not just a blow to trade. It threatens long-standing security arrangements and chips away at the authority the West once wielded with little question. For example, in international forums like the G20, India's assertiveness has begun to reshape agendas, demanding more attention to the needs of the global South. But the fracture is not limited to the global stage. The same refusal to acknowledge shifting realities is creeping into Europe's internal politics, widening divisions within the European project itself. Official narratives across Europe are growing more detached from the realities on the ground. This denial is fueling resentment, deepening rifts, and setting the stage for crises that could shake the continent. When the system stops listening, people stop believing. What follows is not just protest, it is transformation. The rules of the game are changing, often quietly, but the consequences are growing impossible to ignore. Across Europe, the old order is faltering. Populist and hard-right parties now govern in countries such as France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. This is no fleeting reaction. It is a resounding message from millions who feel their voices have been dismissed or distorted by the ruling class. The rise of parties like France's National Rally, Germany's Alternative for Germany, and the United Kingdom Independence Party signals a deep hunger for change. Beneath the news cycles, deeper currents are reshaping the continent. Mass migration, both recent and ongoing, is weaving a new and complex social tapestry. Debates over identity, belonging, and citizenship are erupting in homes, in parliaments, and on the streets. The formulas that once held societies together are failing to account for a world that has already changed. Consider Sweden, once celebrated for its social cohesion, now grappling with questions of integration and security. Or Italy, where surges in migration have fueled political realignment and social anxiety. Across the continent, the sense of a shared European identity is being tested as never before. Yet in Brussels and other capitals, the response has not been real reform. Instead, leaders reach for technical fixes and shortcuts, altering the rules to maintain their grip on power. Consensus falls by the wayside. Debate is bypassed. Democracy itself is thinned out, one procedure at a time. Consider the shift in the European Union from unanimous voting to qualified majority decisions. Though this may sound abstract, the impact is concrete. Smaller nations are steadily losing their influence as the largest states dominate outcomes. Authority is being consolidated at the top, and the shared sense of European purpose is dissolving. In practical terms, this means that countries like Hungary or Slovakia can be outvoted on critical issues, fueling resentment and the feeling of being sidelined. At the same time, authorities cite rising threats, both within and beyond Europe's borders, to justify sweeping new security measures. Militarization intensifies. Emergency laws proliferate. These steps are presented as protections, but more often they insulate elites from public anger, shrouding decisions in opacity and reducing accountability. For instance, in the aftermath of recent terrorist attacks, France and Belgium imposed emergency powers that lingered long after their necessity was questioned. Yet the gravest danger is not sudden revolt. It is the slow, silent retreat of citizens from public life. As faith in the system's legitimacy erodes, people disengage, not out of fear, but out of resignation. Democracy does not collapse in an explosion. It fades in silence as trust evaporates and participation dwindles away. Just as voter turnout has steadily declined in many countries, so too has the willingness to serve in public office or join civic organizations. Now Europe stands at a fateful crossroads. Will its leaders finally acknowledge the warning signs, or will self-preservation and denial drive an even deeper wedge between institutions and the people they are meant to serve? The conflict in Ukraine is only accelerating these pressures, exposing just how far official narratives have drifted from reality. What happens when denial becomes untenable and the truth can no longer be contained? Is Europe truly lost, or can ordinary people still wrest back control as this crisis unfolds? The first step is honesty, facing uncomfortable truths that many prefer to deny. Pretending, hoping for the best, or clinging to old illusions is no longer an option. Naming reality is not only courageous, it is essential for survival. Lasting reform does not emerge from cloistered meetings in Brussels or Berlin. It starts with people, citizens who refuse to accept empty promises and demand action. History teaches us that waiting for elites to negotiate among themselves seldom yields real change. The engine of progress is public pressure. Voices raised, leaders challenged, complacency disrupted. Look back, for instance, to the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, when ordinary people marched and spoke out, toppling a regime that seemed unshakable. Or Poland's Solidarity movement, which began as a labor dispute and became a tidal wave for democracy. In both cases, change started not with governments, but with citizens who refused to stay silent. Defending democracy means resisting panic, but also refusing to disengage. Participation is vital, especially when institutions seem distant or broken. Every act, voting, organizing, even asking difficult questions, shields democratic values from apathy and manipulation. When you engage, you help close the gap between official narratives and reality. Reject slogans and nostalgia. Demand transparency and honesty from your leaders. Insist on facts, on clear strategies, on open debates about the future. When politicians offer soothing words or evasive answers, remember, your right and duty is to demand substance, not distractions. Europe's gravest danger is not military defeat, but the slow surrender of truth and agency within. If citizens stop questioning, they become spectators, watching as their interests are sidelined, their influence fades. This is how democracy's foundations crack, and how real crises take root. Apathy brings a steep price. Without vigilance and action, you risk losing not only your voice, but your economic security, your rights, and the very values that bind your society. The true cost of inaction is measured not in headlines, but in diminished freedoms and vanishing opportunities. In Hungary, for example, the gradual erosion of press freedom did not happen overnight. It was the result of small, often unnoticed decisions made over years. But what can action actually look like in a moment when the stakes feel overwhelming? The path forward requires both clarity and courage, qualities that start on the ground, not at the top. First, inform yourself. Read beyond the headlines. Seek out independent sources, expert analysis, and first-hand accounts. Join local discussions, town halls, community groups, online forums, where real concerns can be aired. In Estonia, digital platforms have enabled citizens to engage directly with government decisions, setting a precedent for participatory democracy. Second, organize. Find others who share your concerns and build networks for collective action. This can mean joining a protest, starting a petition, or forming a local advocacy group. When citizens unite, even small groups can sway policy. In Spain, the grassroots movement that resisted home evictions after the financial crisis forced lawmakers to reconsider harsh austerity measures. Third, hold leaders accountable. Write to your representatives. Demand clarity on their positions about Ukraine, about European reform, about national security. Attend public meetings, ask pointed questions, and refuse to be satisfied with vague answers. Fourth, support independent media and watchdog organizations. These groups play a crucial role in exposing corruption, untangling official narratives, and keeping the public informed. By subscribing, donating, or sharing their work, you help sustain the infrastructure of transparency. Fifth, vote. It may sound simple, but it is the foundation of democracy. In countries where turnout is high, politicians are more responsive. Where apathy reigns, elites consolidate power. In the 1990s, the post-communist transitions of Eastern Europe were driven by citizens who turned out in record numbers, determined to shape their futures. Sixth, teach and learn. Pass on the lessons of history to new generations, children, students, friends. Discuss why democracy matters, how it can fail, and what is required to protect it. Civic education is a bulwark against manipulation and resignation. Seventh, refuse to accept cynicism as wisdom. It is easy to believe that nothing you do matters, that the system is rigged, that power always wins. But history is written by those who act, not those who surrender. Even small acts, signing a petition, sharing credible information, speaking up in a meeting, can ripple outward, inspiring others to do the same. If denial is the true adversary, what will you choose to do now? The most painful truths are not those hidden from us, but those we deliberately refuse to see. For years, Europe's leaders have claimed control, even as the ground quietly shifts beneath their feet. The gap between official assurances and lived experience grows wider, from Kiev's battered hope to Berlin's wary calculations to New Delhi's restless repositioning. But this is not just a crisis of distant power brokers. The denial at the top seeps downward, corroding our economies, sapping our sense of security, and eroding trust in the system itself. When leaders rewrite facts or alter rules in silence, it is ordinary people who pay the price, through lost livelihoods, higher prices, and a sense of being unheard. The promise of easy victories and simple fixes is tempting, but each delay, every partial truth, only deepens the challenge. Now, as open talk of dividing Ukraine and redrawn borders grows, the true costs of denial can no longer be concealed. The decisions made behind closed doors will remap borders, reshape alliances, and determine the world our children inherit. If we accept strategic blindness, we are not innocent bystanders. We become complicit in the unraveling of the very principles we claim to defend. The uncomfortable reality is that the future is being carved out, sometimes without our knowledge, sometimes without our consent. This is the stark choice. Confront the uncomfortable facts, demand transparency, and insist on honest debate, or surrender the future to interests we never chose and forces we barely comprehend. What kind of world do you want to wake up in? Will you pretend the fire is not spreading? Or will you help raise the alarm while action is still possible? The only true failure is to look away when the moment demands courage. Denial is effortless. Responsibility is difficult. But history only remembers those who faced the truth and dared to act. This is our moment to decide which side of history we will stand on.